welcome to Activating Sustainability, the Anthesis podcast. My name is Chris Peterson, and I'm really excited today to be joined by Josh Whitney. Josh is an executive director and the science-based targets lead for Anthesis. And what I really love about Josh, and in particular why I'm excited about today's conversation, is his ability to really deeply understand the key sustainability trends that we're all experiencing, apply a business lens to them, and ultimately to really help organizations navigate their way through those trends to realize value and ultimately reduce their impact. So Josh, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining today.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
There's so much going on within the climate change space, and I'd really love to hear what's standing out to you.
It's been really phenomenal to see the amount of commitments and activity and general momentum on the topic of climate action, really culminating in the Climate Week in New York City activities at the end of September, organized via the United Nations. So there were a number of significant commitments that came out, most of which were really centered around getting corporates to commit to a 1.5 degree Celsius pledge to reduce their emissions aligned to climate science to limit the temperature change by 1.5 degrees. Running up into the event, there were 28 companies that were sort of the founding members of this additional UN Business Ambition Pledge, which builds on the back of the Science-Based Targets Initiative program. During the event and over the course of that week, an additional 59 companies signed on to the pledge. And I think even more exciting is that the momentum has not stopped since. We've seen another 7 companies that have committed over the last 2 weeks to this 1.5 degree pledge. And that builds upon the additional 700 companies that have made their commitments official through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So all in, there are about now 150 companies who have set their targets for at least scope 1 and 2 to be aligned to the 1.5 degree trajectory. And I think when we think about the influence this has, the numbers are really exciting, and the numbers are significant. But the real knock-on effect is the potential and signal that this sends to all of these companies' suppliers. So because of the nature of the target setting framework, it requires all of these companies to also engage their suppliers in setting targets. And so we'll see this cascade effect hit thousands of key suppliers, many of whom are equally large, multi-million, as well as billion-dollar companies, but are really below the radar of a lot of the institutional investors who are driving a lot of pressure and action for companies to set targets. One of the other things that came out of the Climate Week would be remiss to not mention the activity and media interest and real tangible action that Greta Thunberg has had through her incredible speech that she gave on the UN floor, her trip to the events via a carbon neutral sailing vessel from Sweden, and really the momentum that she's consequently having on the policy, corporate, and individual level. There were 2 climate strikes that took place on the Fridays that bookended the event, where millions of people, not only across the U.S., but really across the world, gathered together to raise their voices for concern and demand policy action around climate change. And it was really, I think, profound to see this all take place and being really organized and sort of catalyzed by a 16-year-old. It was really impressive. Personally, made me think about the impact that I'm having in my life thus far compared to her. So fairly profound.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was really inspirational to see that amount of momentum around that. And you talked about reflecting on your own kind of personal impact. How are companies responding to that and all those developments coming out of Climate Week?
Yeah. So there has been a lot of action specific to the climate agenda. The thing to not forget, of course, is that there are a lot of things that are connected into the climate agenda. So it hasn't really been only specific to carbon emissions and traditional scope 1, 2, and 3 focused. There were dozens of other initiatives that were launched on the back of Climate Week. And they focused on things like the energy and water nexus, as well as many other initiatives. One that was focused on food waste, which is a program that was just launched called the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative. And that's focused around food retailers and growers and supply chains that are going to be fighting the food waste loss issue across their networks. SDGs is another big buzzword as well as topic. We saw 17 companies come together, the likes of which represent over $500 billion in revenue, into a new program called the Business Avengers, in the back of the media interest around superheroes, to highlight the crucial role that businesses play in hitting those 17 SDGs by 2030. They are composed of sort of the usual suspects and leaders in the sustainability arena, anchored by Unilever. Another hot topic where some big announcements came is around circular economy and single-use plastics, with Hewlett-Packard announcing the launch of a notebook computer that will be using ocean-bound plastics in some of its components. And then another big one centered in the heart of New York City, of course, is from the finance world, where over 130 banks got together and launched the Principles for Responsible Banking, which aligns their businesses with the Paris Agreement for at minimum 2 degrees, and the SDGs. And this is building off of a similar program that came out a couple of years ago called the Principles for Responsible Investments. So it's really been a number of initiatives, programs across all sectors and across many of the key scopes that climate influence, where we've seen a lot of action.
Yeah, amazing to see that much momentum. And maybe, are there any themes that stand out for you in terms of how companies are positioning their messaging or thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this one is both what I've seen being reflected in the market, particularly resonating from the message that Greta has I think made very, very clear, passionate, and very emotional, as well as myself. And that's, I think, a shift where this is really an existential human threat. It's also real. We've had a number of years of physical climate threats and risks, being realized through most notably weather. But I think the transition is to some extent a bit tongue in cheek, in that this is no longer about just saving the planet, the rainforest, even though the Amazon continues to burn, or even, polar bears, the kind of poster child for climate change. This is really about saving humans, my life, your life, and really the quality of our life as we know it, right? The planet's going to be relatively on the scale of billions of years. It's going to be fine. It will survive this blip of climate change and increases in global temperature. Plants and animals will suffer. They'll die off. They'll evolve. Life will continue operating in a different way than it is today. But it's really, our species and the social and ethical and kind of moral impacts that, honestly are selfishly most at risk here. And that I think we are, whether we realize it or not, also trying to preserve. And I think when we humanize this kind of a storyline, we can kind of tug at both this sort of moral high ground of doing what is right, but also some aspect of self-preservation. And, there are very few things in this world that are more mobilizing and activating than protecting yourself or your family. And so I think that recognition in a lot of individuals, as well as, the CEOs out there who I think have really come to terms with this reality. It's been profound to see that, that is a big mobilizer. And I think as long as we point it in the right direction, there's potential to really increase the activity in this area.
It feels like that's kind of starting to bring out the big guns around this, right? And help to, as you say, hopefully move the needle around engagement. And maybe kind of building off of that, given where we are, what are or should companies and people be doing or people within those companies be doing to start to address this or build off of what they've already been doing?
Yeah. So, the first directional thing is this very real recognition that the clock is ticking, throughout the Climate Week events. And I think over the last couple of months, really, the point has been very clearly made that, we have essentially this next decade, 2020 to 2030, to really course correct before, the domino effect of systems change is sort of irreversibly set into motion. So that's a little bit doomsday, but, on the back of this self-preservation theory, it's also very, very motivating when combined with sort of personal accountability, to making real ambitious commitments to take climate action. And, we're seeing this play out, of course, within the area of greenhouse gas emissions in the three kind of classic and focus areas of Scope 1 emissions, which cover a company's operational direct emissions, Scope 2, which is in the area of indirect emissions from primarily electricity consumption, and then Scope 3, which is a company's upstream and downstream value chains. And so within the areas where we're seeing the most action and I think an evolution of sorts is around Scope 2, where I think we can very gladly and sort of happily say that companies are actually moving beyond Scope 2. And to a large extent, the challenge and problem of addressing Scope 2 emissions is more or less solved with the purchase of renewable electricity. The last decade, I think this has really come to scale at a market level, from on-site installations to wind farms to all the different forms that are available. On a relative order of magnitude, these are now pretty easy to contract, procure, and account for across all buyers in the marketplace, from individuals putting solar on their home to cities and municipalities installing solar farms. To the corporates. And, in a grand scheme of things, from an energy generation and tech development perspective, it's been pretty fast, and also pervasive. We see over 200 companies have set renewable energy 100 commitments. Many of them have already achieved them. We also see many countries making, renewable energy as a portion of their portfolio go from single digits to double digits. With Germany, I think the first half of this year, they produced just under half of their electricity demand from renewables. Costa Rica, the kind of poster child, is up to about 98% of their energy demand coming from renewables. And many EU countries shifting to a 50% target by 2030 and effectively net zero by 2050. And even in the U.S., there's yet another piece of legislation that has a target along those similar lines. A couple points on making it, quote, easy, though, is that for most of the world, that is the case now. I think the one area that we do see continued lag in making this a simple transaction is, unfortunately, in China, where obviously the demand is significant and the current installed base is mostly coal-fired power plants. The reality is over the next, I think 3 to 5 years, that will slowly change. And WRI had a really great 4-part web series that was run through the spring of this past year, which you can go find the posted presentations on. But they did a great job of sort of really going through at a very technical level where renewables are in China specifically. With long story short, being it's complicated, it's costly, and from a legislation perspective, it's going to be slow to come to market. But all that said, renewables are addressing the largest pieces of most companies' footprint, enabling them to hit zero. And that's essentially getting them and unlocking them from being focused on electricity to focus on other portions of their emissions. And that's scope 1 from fleets and stationary fuels and things like that.
Yeah. And so maybe transitioning to that scope 1 piece, are there a lot of developments you're seeing there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So on the back of the RE100 initiative, we have seen this past year the launch of the EV100 initiative, which is, of course, acronym for electric vehicles. So lot of movement there in the last 6 to 18 months. And of course, this is on the back of EVs, slowly growing in their penetration rate in terms of consumer purchases as a part of the vehicle fleet in a lot of countries. Transportation emissions essentially are now the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, particularly in the U.S. And prices are coming down for EVs, led by innovators like Tesla. And many more options are being brought to market, not just for sexy, snazzy, high-end $100,000 vehicles, but also at the low end and for other parts of the transportation economy. So we're seeing public buses and multi-user transportation options coming to market. There's actually a backlog of these vehicles because the demand is so high, in particular from cities and municipalities wanting to transition their traditional diesel or CNG fleets over to EV, as well as to corporates who are interested in buying these buses for their employee transportation, but also 18-wheeler freight and fleets. Of course, the automation of them is going to be a big shock and change to the system, but that also will lead to a lot more efficiency in terms of transport emissions. And then finally, light duty trucks, the latter of which got a huge bump this past September when Amazon, who has been traditionally pretty quiet and conservative in their climate area, made a series of bold commitments aligned to science-based targets, where they'll be purchasing over 100,000 trucks from a relatively new startup called Rivian, of which they own an equity stake in, starting in 2021 to be their prime delivery fleet going into the future. And I think really what this is doing is giving the rest of the corporates out there who, traditionally sit on the fence, wait to see some of the more progressive and aggressive companies make commitments and essentially lower the cost of entry. We're seeing a lot of these folks now get on board and make commitments to EVs. And I think there is this sort of strength in numbers mentality here where we are, I think, at this critical mass point, certainly nearly there, to where EVs will be just rapidly adopted, certainly here within the US over the next decade. The other flip side to that Scope 1 emissions coin is around stationary emissions, right? And so that's going to be, I think, a much longer tail effect in terms of seeing reductions, just sort of realistically based upon the historical success rate that we've seen with companies, doing the hard work of energy efficiency, which is by nature fairly incremental. I think over the last 20 years, all of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So I don't see a tremendous amount of opportunity at scale in big numbers for these emissions to be reduced significantly without a lot of capital put into it. And so in response to that, I think what we're seeing is a lot of interest and focused around fuel switching. But again, this is going to be a challenge because particularly here in the US and North America at large, natural gas, which is essentially the primary stationary fuel here, it's cheap, right? It's abundant, and it also has a relatively lower emissions intensity than coal, as an example. But there are other couple areas that we're seeing, from renewable natural gas to renewable thermal, a initiative that was launched within the last, I think, 2 years or so from REBA, which is the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, is now looking at thermal as yet another area that needs to be innovated on. But I think in general, because of the success of renewables, followed by electric vehicles, which of course will be tied to renewable electricity as the quote fuel source, the long tail of the remainder of Scope 1, I think, will be where companies put and place some bets into now, but they have some runway, I think, to address these emissions while making progress on the other two areas first.
The elephant in the room, though, is Scope 3. Maybe can you provide some perspective there?
Yeah, it definitely is. In a lot of cases, scope 3 emissions are, 3 to 10x a company's traditional operational footprint, which is obviously large. They also have a challenge of influence as well as accounting. But I think what's exciting is, companies are not letting that get in the way of making progress. I think there's increasingly a general acknowledgement that in this case, what you necessarily can't always perfectly measure, you can still manage. And that's been quite exciting. And so on the back of these science-based target commitments, there is a explicit requirement to engage your supply chain. And so most companies are looking at, this via two mechanisms. One is around setting absolute targets where they do have good data, or they make very specific products that they can look to reduce the material inputs that go into, or if they're products that use energy, set performance reductions around making them more efficient. With the other area being getting their suppliers to set their own equally ambitious targets. And so that's looking at leveraging their own existing procurement and sourcing platforms, jumping on the back of other initiatives that might be in existence today that they're participating in, like CDP, other surveys like EcoVadis or the Responsible Business Alliance for a lot of the tech industry, or developing their own supplier networks like many companies have. And essentially, it's going to be hitting the next tier of significantly larger companies to step up in and sort of through that door of emissions accounting, reporting, and target setting. And I think this sort of shadow effect of getting all of the next tier of companies to also jump into the target setting arena on climate targets gives us some hope, I think, for achieving what is a very ambitious timeline that we're up against.
Well, it's good if you give people some hope within this fairly depressing topic. So appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And then taking it up maybe to the 30,000 foot level, are there some big steps that people should be taking as they're evaluating or updating or reassessing their existing program?
So I think to look at this effectively for folks, I would kind of split that into two pieces. So, if you're a company that's just getting on this path, there is an opportunity, I think, to make a lot of change quickly, covering the basics. So, you want to get a handle on your footprint, understand the connection points between cost and carbon and what those drivers are, and explore options to make reductions, and really get yourself some quick wins, most likely by setting near-term targets as opposed to a lot of 10 plus year targets. So you can demonstrate some quick success and some progress. Ways to do that would be looking at your peers, competitors, as well as customers for some of their best practices. Look to them for guidance, and quite frankly, steal what is working for them, because, they have likely done a lot of hard work, had some successes as well as failures. And there's nothing wrong with stealing what is working for them, because it will likely work for you and save you a lot of time. And the flip side to that is, if you've already done a lot of work in this area, the two things that we talked about here in some detail are worth revisiting. And that's, one, looking at your energy procurement strategy and really considering what it will take financially as well as operationally to get to RE100. That is really the single largest and practically easiest step to making significant progress on reducing your emissions aligned to climate science. And essentially the contracting tools and mechanisms and market is really there waiting for you to lean in. There's very little in the way there to make significant progress. And then the last is of course around looking at your scope 3. And so that's doing things like setting an inventory, identifying your hotspots, connecting that to areas of risk in your supply chain, and exploring how an engagement program can add value beyond just to focus on carbon. And of course, if you make products, look for ways to reduce the impact of those, particularly in their use phase.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh. Fascinating to get your perspective and the insights about how to move forward. So thank you very much for that time and insight. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Maybe just to mention to everybody, if they want to reach out to Josh directly, he can be reached at Josh Whitney at anthesisgroup.com. And then there's a dedicated SPT webpage under our advisory and communications page on the Anthesis website. Lots of insights and info there, as well as links to our lessons learned from developing SPT's blog series, which is available off of that page or off of our blog page. But again, lots of really valuable insights. Josh, thank you again for the time. Really appreciate it. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.